Hello, everybody. Welcome.
Hey Daniel.
Hey, how you doing?
Great, how are you?
I am good, thanks.
Great to be back.
Nice to have you back. I think I think you might be our first repeat guest.
Oh, well.
Yeah. Popular caller, that's right.
It's a pleasure.
Wonderful. We will give it maybe we'll give it another minute or so for people to trickle in.
Perfect.
Is it raining where you are?
It's definitely pretty overcast over here. I'm in like Midwest Toronto area.
I feel like it's the appropriate weather for a discussion on the rainy day fund. Um,
Yeah, couldn't have timed it better.
right. Okay, let's jump in. So this week on Coffee with an Estate Lawyer, I'm joined by Cindy, who is coming back, and today we are going to be talking about emergency funds. Sort of more generally planning for uncertainties. So whether that is putting money away in the event that something should happen and you needed to draw on that money, if it's finding insurance products that might help in the event that you sort of need them, and estate planning. So wills and powers of attorney and putting in place the documents that are important to put in place if and when uncertainty hits. So
Yeah.
maybe Cindy, for anyone who didn't join last time, I'll give you sort of an opportunity to introduce yourself and speak a little bit about what you do and why you are uniquely qualified to speak on the subject. And then we can jump in and start the discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you. So my name's Cindy. I am a certified financial planner working with Paper and Coin. We are a financial coaching company that has geared towards niching into the millennial market. So we are a group of millennials looking to help out and support our peers, very heavily focused on the financial literacy aspect. We are looking to fill the gaps that are otherwise left by traditional banking systems or working with traditional advisors. I find that there was a big gap in our demographic with the desire to learn concepts and truly understand and be able to do things yourself. And so that's what we're trying to fulfill. So, planning for emergencies and being able to take big unexpected life moments and consequences into your own hands. I mean, that's what we're really all about. And that's what today is about as well. So let's dive in.
Awesome. So, I mean, question number one, it's most basic. What is an emergency fund?
An emergency fund, first and foremost, should really be seen as your own store of money to handle emergencies. Well, what's an emergency? Those unforeseen events and moments that have huge financial consequences. So we're not talking about, oh, well, I decided today I want to buy a new $500 vacuum or something. That's not an emergency. We'll save for that in a different way, but losing a job, getting sick or injured, or being stuck isolating at home, you can't really work to your full potential. Having an emergency fund to deal with disruptions to your income, and otherwise large increases to your expenses is how you should look at it.
Right. And so, I mean, right now we are, we've just crossed the year mark really of working from home and sort of living through this global pandemic. And so it's possible that if we were having this conversation, 2 years ago, your answers may have been a little bit different because now this concept of emergency and what it might look like to have your life disrupted is much more present in people's minds and real in a whole new way. So, I mean, this next question might be a little bit difficult given what we're living through, but how much money should someone have in their emergency fund?
I mean, generally as much as possible, but how much depends on where you're starting from. If you're in a position where you are heavily indebted with a lot of high interest debts, where that is eating away at your cash flow, maybe you want to start small. And I usually advocate, okay, just aim for $1,000. Put as much as your financial efforts towards getting to that one initial benchmark, and then allow yourself to focus on addressing those very high interest debts. And while you're doing so, you want to keep sprinkling a little bit more in there to the best of your ability. But of course, debt sitting at 20% should kind of take a bit of precedence there, because you can put money aside while getting eaten away at 20% in the other direction. You kind of have to find a balance. So start small, focus on the high interest debts. And once that's out of your way, you really want to aim to hit that 3 to 6 months worth of your living expenses is an ideal.
And when we talk about the emergency fund and the money that's sitting in an emergency fund, is that being invested? Like what's your recommendation when it comes to sort of really, like, it's not sitting in cash under your bed anymore. So where is it? Like, what's the optimal place for the emergency fund?
Ideally, it's sitting in something like a high interest savings account, or a regular savings account that can get you a little bit of interest, but is not exposed to market risk. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to planning for short-term goals, you don't want to invest your money because you're going to need it in the near future, and you don't want it to suffer a huge loss. Well, with an emergency, we don't know when that's going to happen, and we should assume that it might be as soon as today or tomorrow. And so that same short-term mentality should apply, where you don't want to expose it to risk, and you don't want to have it locked in either. So you don't want it in something like an RSP where you're going to get hit with withholding taxes. You don't want it in a GIC, which is, a safe investment, but it's not liquid. So you won't be able to access it when you need it. So definitely in an account that's readily accessible and not exposed to risk, and a high interest savings account satisfies both of those things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you had it in a GIC and it was locked in and the emergency hit and you were 2.5 years before you could take it out, or before you could take it out without penalty or something like that, that's not really a great place for that to be.
No.
What's some advice that you give people around how to start building their emergency fund?
The best way to do it is honestly to automate it. I personally bank, and again, I'm not an affiliate, but I personally bank with Tangerine. And I like their platform because they make it very easy to set up money rules for yourself, where, every purchase you make, you can earmark, take an extra, round this up to the nearest dollar and put it into a savings account, or every dollar that goes in, take 10% and put it away. But to the best of your ability, I also recommend to create what I call your own at-source deductions, just as your employer does to your paycheck. Every time you get a paycheck, line up your automatic contributions such that either a dollar amount or a percentage gets tucked away into your savings automatically, out of sight, out of mind. Because if you see a larger amount sitting in your checking accounts, you're in your head, you're like, okay, that's how much I have to spend. But you want to make sure you pay yourself. So if you just take it away ahead of time, you see what's left, you don't even know it went missing.
For sure. I mean, that's a really, it's good advice. And all of the banks right now have that ability, right? Like with any of the banks, you can go ahead and say, you know what, instead of dropping 100 in the checking account, just take 20 off the top, and I don't ever want it to sit in this account. And then when I go and look at that other account, I think most people will probably be pretty happy to see, like, oh yeah, if it was here, I would have just spent it on things that I don't necessarily need. But it's sitting over here and it's safe, and that's a good place for it.
Yeah, I think it feels a lot more onerous to think that, okay, at the end of the month, I have to make sure I have $100 left to put into savings because that's what I want for myself. But to have $25 a week just disappear, you don't even notice it. And you're accomplishing the same effect. If anything, setting yourself up for, greater interest returns if it's in there sooner, to earn a little something from your high interest savings account.
For sure. So I just saw a question come through, and it's something that we touched on, and maybe this person jumped in maybe right after. So it asked if an emergency fund is something that's sitting in a savings account, or can it be your TFSA, let's say? Can it be an account that exists that you've been putting money in in the case of a TFSA, it's generally with the view towards tax savings. But can you look at your TFSA as your emergency fund to say, well, I don't want to have a TFSA and then this separate emergency fund because I'm taking any of the money that I think I don't need to sort of use to fund my life, and I'm putting it over into my TFSA or RRSP. So how should people be thinking about that?
Yeah, I can appreciate the viewpoint that some people might see like, well, that's kind of a waste of potential to have it sitting, in the savings account when I can have it invested. And to that, I'll say, honestly, if you're at the point where you are well funded beyond that 3 to 6 months worth of expenses, you have more than that, like well more than enough of that, then sure, you can have it in your TFSA. I would say maybe just ensure that a portion of it is invested conservatively, but invested nonetheless. But to someone who is just starting out, that shouldn't be your first go-to because you're taking very little and you're exposing it to risk. But if you're already in the position where you have quite a bit saved and to you it feels like, well, why would I keep $10,000 just sitting idle when I can also allow it to benefit from returns? I think that makes more sense, but it's only because they have that financial cushion of a lot of other assets and savings to fall back on. So if you're just starting out, I would say just stick to, a high interest savings, regular savings, not invested. Once you're in a comfortable savings position, you have quite a bit of assets, then, you are able to withstand a little bit more risk and just put it in the TFSA with the rest.
Great. Okay, we've got another question coming in here around RRSPs. So it says, I'm curious about learning more about RRSP and estate planning. I heard if you don't use RRSPs after you retire, you can't just withdraw them. How does that factor into planning?
Okay, so I think maybe the phrasing of the question might be a little confused. When you retire, maybe you retire at age 60. It doesn't mean that, RSP suddenly shut down because you have stopped working. There is an actual rule where you can only contribute into your RSPs up until the end of the year in which you turn 71. So that is true. You might retire much sooner than that, in which case you can continue to fund your RSP. Nothing is going to prevent you from doing so. If you don't need to withdraw from it at that point in your life, then great, keep adding to it. But by the time you're turning 71, it is mandated that you must collapse your RSP, and now it turns into what's called a RIF, a Registered Retirement Income Fund. And then you are meant to withdraw. There are minimum amounts that you must withdraw every year based on your age. So you have to start pulling out of that account, and essentially it's designed to be depleted by the end of your life. So you got the tax break for putting the money in, but eventually the government would like to get those tax funds back, and so it needs to be depleted at some point. It can't just be hoarded in there, passed on for legacies after legacy.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so let's thank you for answering that. Let's jump back into the emergency fund discussion a little bit. What sort of role does insurance play in not just emergency funds, but as we sort of broaden the discussion into uncertainties and things that could happen where you would all of a sudden be in a position where you needed cash? When you're speaking to clients of yours, what's the advice that you give around insurance planning?
Yeah, some, question insurance, like what's the point of paying these premiums on just a maybe situation? I'm like, okay, that's a fair question. You can certainly try to self-fund, but can you think of a situation where there is a possible financial outcome that is so drastic that, 6 months worth of expenses saved up is just not sufficient? And in a lot of cases, when I'm talking to a parent, when I'm talking to someone with a lot of debts or a large mortgage or a situation like that, the answer is yes. They think like, well, yeah, if something happened to me, my family very much depends on my income. If I have a child, I'm worried about their well-being, and 6 months worth of expenses cut it. Insurance allows you to obtain a lot of security for a very minimal amount, a smaller premium for a very large windfall otherwise. But it's not just for individuals with large debts or parents. If you're living on your own and you are a business owner and you consider, well, what am I going to do if I lost my source of income? I was unable to work because I got sick or I got injured, and I don't have a spouse to rely on or a family member to support me. And then 6 months worth of expenses may not be enough when you're in that position. And so you start to consider things like disability insurance or critical illness insurance. So I think a lot of people hear insurance and they just automatically think life insurance. Okay, well, I'm not a parent, I don't need it. But single individuals should consider it as well, because if you're left on no one but yourself to rely on, do your current assets support a scenario where you are taken, your ability to earn an income is taken away for you for more than 6 months? What do you do in that position? And that's when insurance comes into play.
Right. Yeah, and I think insurance is one of those interesting things, because people often think, well, I might not get any benefit from it. Like, am I really going to pay for something that I might never need, and then that money is gone or wasted, or and there's this psychological part to that, which is, well, if at the end of that amount of time I never needed it, well, I would rather have all of that money sitting in my bank. Do you get that question a lot?
All the time. And to them, I throw it back at them, be like, it's interesting because we don't question car insurance and home insurance. And that's forced upon us. We must get it. And it's the same thing. If your house doesn't burn down, if you don't get into a car crash and you don't make a claim, are you actually upset that you don't have the insurance? You were told to get it. You're like, okay, fine, I guess I must. And in a lot of cases, these insurance plans are very expensive and can be a lot more expensive compared to what you get out of it versus getting a life insurance policy, which could be cheaper and you get more. So we don't question that. But when it comes to protecting our own livelihoods and our families, we scrutinize every dollar because, it's our choice to make. And so we feel like, okay, well, I get to be picky about this one. But you should also, if you feel that way about life insurance, then you should also be just as upset about your home and auto insurance, which I think most people are not. So, just reframe your mindset a bit and consider what it is you might potentially get out of it based on the minimal premiums you have to put into it.
Right. I'm going to ask a question that we probably touched on in our last discussion, but just sort of for the benefit of anybody who is now watching sort of this for the first time or hearing you for the first time, just on a more general sense, what are ways that people can sort of protect themselves from unforeseen events from a financial position? And it doesn't have to be limited to the emergency fund. What sort of advice are you giving people when they say, like sort of from multiple angles, maybe, how do I make sure that I'm in a comfortable position?
Starting right from cash flow planning, I work with my clients and I have a tool that allows them to see things based on a year's glance. So you're able to see the months that have passed, the months that are ahead of you, and the month that you are in. And I think it starts there with being able to anticipate well ahead of time, potential income shortfalls or potential months where expenses are going to increase. So you can start to prepare well ahead of time. So beyond that, what are other situations where you can prepare yourself well ahead of time? And you consider things like wills and powers of attorney, where you want to prepare yourself today while you're alive for what might happen when you are not. And that is done through a will. And a power of attorney allows you to prepare for scenarios which, financial maneuvers need to be made, but you cannot physically be present to make it. And so you're allowing someone else to make sure what needs to get done can get done, with your authorization. So things like that allow you to ensure that your plan for your life still goes the way you hope that it will be, even if you personally cannot make that happen for yourself. And so now you put that into the directive of a will, or you put that into a directive of a power of attorney.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about powers of attorney as we talk about emergency funds is people think that a power of attorney is for themselves. And it is. But if we can think of an example of someone who is supporting someone else. So you are supporting your parents, you're supporting a sibling, you're supporting a cousin financially. And you might be their emergency fund, so to speak. And now if something happens to you and no one can access that money, that's going to have an adverse effect on these other people in your life who are relying on you, or who might be relying on you. And and people rarely think about stuff like that. And so, protecting yourself and protecting others, some of these things are, they're uncomfortable to think about, they're uncomfortable potentially to talk about, but they're really important, both for yourself and for the people that you love. And it's an important conversation to have, so that people can understand, some of the repercussions of not planning or not being prepared.
Yeah, it can be uncomfortable to talk about. And I mean, anything, revolving insurance is based on a situation that is very, very uncomfortable. It is the opportunity to be supported for one of those uncomfortable situations. So what's worse, having that conversation now and setting that support in place, or not having set it up and now being in a drastically more uncomfortable situation because you have nowhere to turn and you're kind of left on your own, or those who were relying on you have nowhere to turn because nothing was in place. I think, what's more uncomfortable, having the conversation now or being left to sort of bump into walls when it really matters?
Right. And one thing that I'm curious, as sort of society evolves and changes somewhat, and I'm sure especially with millennials in your client base, they're, whereas once upon a time, everyone may have been a salaried employee, and now we're sort of in the era of, freelancers and contractors. Is your advice different for those groups of people? Whereas a freelancer may expect to, or may not expect, but their year might look different from a cash flow perspective, and there's a little bit more uncertainty. And so is planning different depending on sort of what your circumstances are like?
Yeah, absolutely. Because some do have the amazing benefit of being well supported by the company they work for. But a lot of us are just trying to make it for ourselves, and we have no one but ourselves to depend on. And so you're not supported by a cushy corporate pension. You can only get so much through CPP and OAS, and you're left to fund your retirement on your own. And so you're already worried about that so far ahead down the line, in addition to, okay, what might happen tomorrow, never mind 30 years from now when I retire. So it definitely becomes a very, very crucial conversation to have with the freelancers I work with, which are the bulk of my clients, to be honest, are working for themselves. And so I think the need to plan is very apparent to them. And I am seeing a huge spike in interest in harnessing the financial savvy and know-how to learn these concepts and know how to manage money for yourself. It's not even something that I feel like I need to push on people anymore. I think a lot of individuals are realizing for themselves, not only through the realities of a pandemic, but also experiencing that ebb and flow from the month-to-month cash flow. Nothing is guaranteed when you're self-employed. So it is very crucial to have a plan in place and be able to look so far down the line and consider what's the worst that can happen, because it sounds like I'm the only one who is here to deal with it. I don't have something like workers' comp. I probably can't qualify for EI. If I really get injured, I might not have anyone but myself to rely on. So it is different who I'm speaking to and the advice I give, and it becomes very, very crucial, especially to those who are freelancers.
For sure. Okay, we've got another question here. It's more on the estate planning side, so maybe I'll tackle it. So the question is, what happens to your bank accounts and investments if someone passes away and does not have a will? So it's a good question. So there's really two things to consider. So if someone passes away without a will, your assets get distributed based on the rules of the province where you live. And that depends on what your relationships are, what your family relationships are on the date of death. So if you have no spouse and no kids, there's one result. And it might be that it goes to both of your parents if they're both alive. If your parents aren't alive, it will go to siblings. That's in Ontario. Different provinces have different rules about what happens. If you have a spouse and kids, so there's a lot of different results. So that's the answer of where your assets go. But in terms of how they get there, they don't just go on their own. So if you have no will, it means that you haven't taken the step of naming an executor, which is one of the really important things that you do in a will, is you decide who's the person that I trust to manage my affairs when I'm gone. When you have a will, you also set out who you want to get your stuff. So when you have a will and you pick the person to distribute, it's more straightforward, let's say. But if you have no will, it means that someone in your life needs to step up and take that role. And then once they're put in that role by the court, so they need to make an application to the court, they need to be accepted into that role. There's some paperwork, there's a stamp, and then that person is going to go ahead and distribute your assets.
Oh, we froze for a second. I'm here.
Okay, I'm back. That person who gets put into that role is going to be responsible for collecting your assets. So if you had a bank account, an investment account, and they were held at a particular bank, that person's going to go get those accounts transferred from your name into the name of your estate, and then they're going to be responsible for distributing them based on the rules of the province. So there's no flexibility. The rules are the rules. That person can't say, but you know what, I think he probably would have wanted to give a little bit to this person. That doesn't exist. So if you don't have a will, you haven't made any of those choices for yourself, and it's gonna go by the strict rules of the province where you live.
And being named an executor is a really huge role. So, I'd ask you, for those who have been named executors and maybe feel like they're not quite equipped for the role, or it's thrown at them, what's your advice to those individuals who just feel like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I've been named because I was trusted?
It's a great question. And my guess is that most people who get named have never been named before, right? Like I don't have the statistics to back it up, but it's not a role that someone does time and time and time again. And so a lot of people probably end up in that exact same spot, which is like, I've just been named, what do I do? So, and it's a big role, it's a big responsibility, and there's a lot to it. So, one thing that is positive is that you don't have to do it alone. So in most wills, there's a specific provision that says, my executor can hire professional advisors to assist. It doesn't mean that you're handing everything off, but it means that if you need help with something that is legal, you could go and get help from a lawyer. If you need help with something that is, accounting, you can get help from an accountant. And so you don't have to take this on entirely on your own. You can sort of figure out who are the people who might be able to assist, right? If money is going to sit into an investment account, it doesn't mean that you need to manage that account. There's going to be certain decisions that you're going to have to make for sure. But you can find some help in different places. And certainly it's a big role, and it's daunting for a lot of people. Some of it will depend on what the assets are like, what the relationships are like. So it might be a much simpler, maybe simple is not the right word, but it may be an easier role if you are the executor and all of the property of the estate is going to you. And it may be a lot more difficult if you're the executor and you're actually not a beneficiary at all, and there's 15 beneficiaries, and you're responsible for giving 1/15 to each of them. So the terms of the will are going to dictate a little bit about how complicated the role might be, but it's important to know that there are resources out there, so that you can start reading and learning, and that there's people that you can turn to that can help.
And as a named executor, in anticipation of the fact that, okay, I might need to hire experts to help me out, should I be expected, if I'm not a beneficiary, to otherwise get some financial support dictated to me through the will to help me execute my role as executor?
Yeah, so there's sort of two different sides to that question. So one is compensation. One is whether or not you're going to be actually compensated. So money that is going to come to you, that is going to stay with you for acting in that role. And the other side of that is using money from the estate to pay for those things. So if I start with the second one, using money from so if you need to hire a lawyer or an accountant, that's going to be funded by the money that's in the estate. That's not an out-of-pocket expense. No one's asking you as the executor to put your own money on the line to go out and get this help, which is really good and important to know. It may be that you actually have to put some money up front at some point in time, but that you will get that money back. That's the idea behind sort of that relationship. And then in terms of compensation, there's there's no one size fits all. So in certain instances, someone will not be compensated at all. In other instances, the will might spell out exactly what the compensation looks like on a monthly basis, on an annual basis, on a percentage basis. So that's something that people should sort of understand may or may not form part of the will.
Okay, so there's that difference there between being indemnified with the expenses you take on versus actually being compensated with like a profit for doing the role.
That's right. And so I'll say, you can name an individual as an executor. You can name a trust company as an executor. So an individual, you can name a spouse, a friend, an advisor to act in that role, or you could actually name a professional trust company. Each of the banks has a trust company associated with it, and there's independent trust companies, and they will take on the role of executor for a fee that gets set out right at the very beginning. You understand, if I decide that I want this particular trust company to act as executor, I'm going to know that a percentage of my estate is going to go towards that trust company for taking on that duty. And so, this should and probably will become its own discussion around who to name as executor. I think Aaron and I sort of dabbled in it months ago, but sort of naming an individual versus naming a trust company. There's different things to consider there. But yes, you may, or when you're creating your will, you may or may not decide that compensation is something that needs to be included. And oftentimes that'll depend on who are you giving things to and who is in that role of executor. And so, like I said before, if you're leaving everything to your spouse and your spouse is your executor, you probably don't need to compensate your spouse because it's all the same money. It's going to end up in their hands anyways. That changes a little bit if you choose an advisor or someone who's not benefiting at all, and you say, well, why would they do this otherwise? So some things to consider there.
And you can name an executor if someone was to create a will through Epilogue. That's prompted in the process?
Yeah, you can name an executor. It's one of the big things that you do. And one of the big important decisions that you are making is who should be the executor, who should be responsible for managing my affairs and carrying out my wishes.
Interesting. If an executor is not doing a great job and I would say the beneficiaries see what's happening and they're displeased, is it ever possible to, boot an executor out of their position for maybe just not adhering to the will appropriately? How is that conversation had?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. You need to bring it to court. So it's not a simple process, but it may be necessary depending on what's happening. If there's been undue delays, if you're years later and there's no legitimate reason why things haven't been distributed or why certain things haven't happened, that may be a time where the beneficiaries get together and say, what's going on here? This person's not doing their job. As an executor, you're in the role of fiduciary, which means you have certain responsibilities to the beneficiaries. And so if you are, if you're not doing the job or if you're doing a terrible job, there is an opportunity for the beneficiaries to apply to court to say, we need to get this person removed. In terms of what that looks like, again, very case specific, dependent, but there certainly is that ability.
Yeah, that's very insightful.
Yeah, it's and it happens for sure. It happens, but yeah, it's all very interesting.
Yeah, I think a lot of people. I was going to say, I think a lot of people don't really realize the whole executive role of the will. You just know, okay, I should create one, but there's that whole other conversation, which is almost, more important than anything. It's good to know what you want to happen, but who's going to make it happen for you?
Right. So I'll say very quickly, because we're talking about it. When people think about wills, it's like it's behind a curtain, right? They have no idea what they're getting into and what's going to be asked of them and what's required to create this document. And the reality is it's pretty straightforward. And it's really not so many different things that you need to think about or decide on. So in our process, when you go through Epilogue, for most people, you're going to see 5 sections. So the basics. What's the basic information about you? Family. So if you let us know that you have a spouse, 5 sections. What are the basic information about you? Family. So if you let us know that you have a spouse, 5 sections. What are the basic information about you? Family. So if you let us know that you have a spouse, 5 sections. What are the basic information about you? Family. So if you let us know that you have a spouse, 5 sections. What are the basic information about you? Family. So if you let us know that you have or a partner, and you let us know that you have children, we're going to ask certain questions about them. Then, depending on the age of your children, or if you have pets, or if you have minor children or pets, you're going to see a section on guardians. You're going to name some people to be responsible for caring for your minor children or pets. You're going to see a section on executor. So who is this person that's going to be responsible for managing everything? And a section on distribution. How do you want to distribute things? And that's it. Like, that's the whole process. So for some people, once they actually get in and start, they realize, oh, it's pretty straightforward. Like, I know who that person should be that's going to be my executor. And I know who the guardian would be if something were to happen. And the distribution is pretty straightforward. It's for most people, it is family first. And so when people get into sort of different categories, maybe of assets or more complicated family relationships, this might not be the service for them. But for people that have some certainty around some of these things, it actually ends up being relatively easy to do.
Yeah, it sounds it. And I have perused the website. It looks really, really good. And I actually gifted my parents Valentine's Day. You had a special going on. So I was very pleased about that. Great services.
Awesome. I see we're over time. It's funny. I think we spent the first half, I was asking you questions, and then at some point we switched duties, and you took over as host, but that's great. Because both of these things are interesting, and they're totally interconnected when you think about uncertainties and planning for the future, and being prepared. Just the importance of making sure that happens right now. If you can start today, planning, whether it's an emergency fund, so whether it's starting to put money away to make sure that if something were to happen in 3 months or 3 years, that you would be much more prepared than if you hadn't taken any of these steps. Then sort of moving into planning, sort of down the line. So your estate planning documents, powers of attorney, will, it's all important stuff to start doing. And I think sort of what's coming out of this conversation is that it doesn't have to be difficult to do, but there's some really simple, actionable steps that will go a long way to putting you in a much better position going forward.
Exactly. I agree.
Awesome. Any last words? We're over time, but I mean, there's no strict time limit. So anything else that you'd like to add that we didn't touch on?
No, I don't think so. At the end of the day, it is all insurance, right? Ensuring that what you want is carried through, whether it's through a will or actual an insurance policy, and everything has a cost. So, to those who criticize every dollar, just consider the other side of the picture. The financial consequences of not doing it. Is that a greater financial burden than actually doing it? In which case, that should give you the answer of whether or not you need it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a really good way of putting it. There's a cost to doing it, and there's a cost to not doing it. And I think in both of these instances, the cost to not doing it is often greater, and potentially far, far greater than the cost of doing it.
Agreed.
Awesome.
Well, it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Welcome back. And it was nice to have you back, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Daniel. You too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.